With week 1 of the Overwatch League over, we had some banger matches, some upsets, and some teams over or underperforming their rankings. Who were the winners and losers of week 1? Let's get into it. First off, the meta has been very fluid, with many different things being played. The most common one being a Soldier, Genji, Winston, or Doom, Ana, and Lucio comp, but Ryan, Sigma, Double Flex, Diva, and even Hog comps were shown. Teams seem to have just leaned into what they are good at rather than forcing a mirror for a lot of the part. And I'm a fan. It makes everything more exciting. I also think that team fights have been a lot more back and forth. I know there was a lot of statistics about how if you lose your first member, there's a higher chance of you losing the overall fight, and I agree with that. But I think there's much less times where one team just completely is just 5 versus 0 by the end of the fight. I think each team always tends to find at least one pick on the other side every fight, and I think that's really exciting. I'm personally a really big fan of Overwatch 2 so far. I'm loving it. I think Overwatch Season 5 has been a blast. Just fix the production issues, please. That's the only thing. But let's look at some of the teams. Starting at the top of the rankings, we have the San Francisco Shock, with 2 sweeps over London and Paris. The Shock really impressed me, but it's important to hamper your expectations a bit. They played London and Paris, who are probably the third and second to worst teams in NA respectively, but still, the dominance Shock showed should not be underestimated. Sam, Proper, and Finn were the stars of the show, I'd say. Sam absolutely dominated on the Genji, getting massive value from his plays every time he used it. Proper popped off just as much as Sam did, except he did it not only on the Genji as well, but the Soldier and Tracer as well, showing off his insane mechanics and flexibility. And Finn really speaks for himself. Shock may as well have been playing the Glads, as Finn made sure the enemy team was purple the entire match. Also caught their enemies sleeping on more than a few key moments. These guys were dominant the whole way through, all 3 coming into the Rookie of the Year conversation early on, especially Proper and Finn in my opinion. Proper did some silly flanks though, not sure what that was all about, still love him though. Kilo, Kaluge, and Violet also had great showings, but not star-worthy as the other 3. Kilo was kind of quiet, but Diff Sparker and even Glister, which is pretty impressive. Kaluge had an amazing showing on the Winston, getting a lot of kills, peeling well, and coordinating dives with Sam, Violet, and Proper. But he did feed a bit trying to 1v5 the Spitfire in their game, which did hurt them a bit and cost them a few minutes on Eichenwald. He's still very good though. Violet, I feel, still lacks a bit in the main support mechanics, but he was improved, and his peels for Finn were actually pretty good. He saved Finn more than a few times with well-timed boops, speed boosts, and sound barriers. Overall, this team looks scary. Probably top 3 NA at the moment. Sam, Proper, and Kilo is a disgusting DPS line. Kaluge has a really solid Winston, and Finn Violet is a nice support line. But Kaluge and Violet may be some weaknesses that could be exploited against teams that Proper Sam can't just 2v5. The match against Houston will be telling for the rest of their season, in my opinion. But they look really good. I do want to see them flex a bit more, though. But first, before we move on to our next team, let's hear what Eli Meyer has to say about their match versus the Paris Eternal.
Shock vs Eternal was a little disappointing honestly. Both Naga and Glister were heavily DPS stiffed, and even though Proper had a banger of a debut match, I was honestly a bit more impressed by Sam. This guy popped off on Genji, showing why he was brought onto this team, and Proper's Soldier alongside it made for a killer DPS duo.
Next up is the Reign. But they look just as, if not more scary, opening their season with a 3-1 victory over the Florida Mayhem and a sweep to the New York Excelsior. These guys are nuts. Hawk is looking like maybe the best Doom after Dante. Even then, Hawk could be better. Nero has shown an insane amount of flexibility, popping off on the Reaper, Tracer, Genji, and even pulling out the Echo at times. He's just nuts. Guy is absolutely crazy on the Soldier. He just doesn't let up the pressure whatsoever, and is just such a menace. Ultraviolet is really the star of the show though. He's absolutely unbelievable. I swear, whenever a Genji tries to blade, whenever an Ana tries to nano someone, whenever a Winston tries to dive Ultraviolet's homing missile of a sleep dart will find them and put them to sleep. Not to mention the fact that he has a 3-man Bionade on cooldown pretty much. He's absurdly good. He's honestly matching Finn and is a frontrunner for Rookie of the Year alongside Proper and Finn as mentioned before. OG is also insane. He had some growing pains in the first match where he died first a lot, but he was top tier in the game against New York Excelsior. Again, much like the Shock, they haven't played a top tier team. New York currently aren't very good, though I consider Florida on a pretty high level. But Atlanta have no real weaknesses right now. You put a gun to my head and maybe choose a team that's the best at this moment, it'd definitely be Atlanta. We gotta see them against a top team first. Their game against the Justice next week will be very telling. But first, before we move on to the Gladiators, let's hear Eli Meyer's thoughts on their match against the Florida Mayhem.
Mayhem vs Rain was an interesting one. I feel like it could have gone to 5 maps if map 2 went a little differently, but the most surprising thing for me was how good Nero's Genji was. Since Eileen was the Genji player for the charge, we've never really gotten to see Nero's Genji all that much, but combined with Ultraviolet's amazing Ana play, it made for some great highlights. Hawk also turned out to be a pretty good fist, and it was nice to see Sermaged in the lineup and not facing visa issues. Glad he made it in time.
Next in the standings are the Los Angeles Gladiators, with 3-1 victories over both the Boston Uprising and New York Excelsior. These guys look good, but I can't help but feel a bit worried. There are a lot of bright spots. Kevster is as dominant as ever, having tons of carry moments on the Soldier, Genji, and Tracer. Reiner has come into his own as a top Winston that has even busted out the Doom and looked pretty good. Shu is still an absolute god on the Ana and Baptiste, though he made some questionable choices. Funny Astro is as crazy as ever, and On, Space, and Scoot are still great at their comfort picks as ever, but I can't help but be underwhelmed by this team. Why did they drop maps to these supposed lower tier teams? Well, one reason is, and I hate to say it, Patafan's inconsistency. I love Patty, and I think he has a lot of potential, and he did have a lot of good moments, but for every 3k played he gets 2 fights where he dies first or does nothing. I'm hoping it's a mental thing that can be ironed out, but for right now, I don't think he's high up on the Flex DPS tier list, and has to be built up by Kev or Reiner a lot. Honest and Skewed have also not shown a lot of flexibility. Ons is still cracked out of his mind on the Widow, but I can see why they prefer Kevsters on the Soldier. When Ons busted it out, he didn't impress me all that much. Skewed also did literally nothing on the Zen, no offense. He was great at Brig, but his Zen, no. I also think the Glads also have the increased spaghetti droppage other teams up here don't have. The Shock and Rain have total confidence in themselves, and that makes them scary. They aren't afraid to throw their everything into a fight they deem winnable. But the Gladiators are less sure and more susceptible to snowballs, which made them lose maps to teams that should be at least 2 tiers below them. It's a bit concerning, and I don't rate them as highly as of this moment due to that. But they do seem like a great team overall. Their match against the Fuel next week will be very telling on how good they actually are. But first, let's hear Eli's thoughts on the Glads match against the NYXL.
For the first match of the weekend, Glads vs XL, it went about how I expected. XL had their moments, and especially Archeon Echo I found to be impressive, but in the end Glads were by far the better team. Any concerns I had about Patafan pre-season are thrown out the window. He popped the hell off on Genji, and Tracer and Reiner looked very strong on the Winston as well. One more small thing that I noticed was how Gangnam Jin was the one on Lucio and not my Unbong. Thought it would be the other way around, but it isn't super big in the grand scheme of things.
With the sweep to the Dallas Fuel and a close 5-map loss to the Toronto Defiant. Let's start with the positives. Pelican is as good as ever, with jaw-dropping echo play, and even showing the flexibility to go onto the Soldier and Genji and pop off, though not as hard as his echo. His dives with Dante and area control were absurd. Barrett, I think, is less standout, but has proven to be a really strong Soldier in Ashe, although I don't think he's done enough to be in the Rookie of the Year conversation yet. Iris has proven all the doubters right that he's a bad one-trick, and has become an incredibly strong Ana. His sleeps and nades in both games were not to be messed with. He's one of the best supports in the game right now. Lastro, individually, I don't think is top tier, but he has some great peel and boops. He impressed me a lot this week. Dante has also come out as probably the best individual Doomfist player in the league. But if each player was so good, how did they get such inconsistent results? I think what's happened to an extent is that they perfected the Doomfist Echo comp, and only really that. They did look good on that Diva double hit scan comp, but frankly, I think the Dallas game was very much the exception and not the rule. Dallas seemed to be underperforming, as they looked much more clean against the Justice. Not to take away from that game, though. Houston played the comp to perfection, but as we saw in the Toronto game, they lose their footing when they have to switch it up. Dante is a fantastic Doomfist, but he can't play any other tank to a top level, so as a Doomfist is effectively countered like Twilight and Sharong did, there really is no plan B. If Pelican has to switch off the Echo due to a bad map, or due to, say, Finale Hisu and Moose pressuring him, the team plays significantly worse without his insane dives to play around. They need to learn how to play slower and less aggressive. It worked against the Fuel, who are also very aggressive, but against the Defiant, who are a bit more passive and stick with their supports, it definitely hurt. Shock are much more well-rounded, and I've seen how to counter the comp. Finale and Tracer could shut down Pelican. Imagine Kilo on the Soldier and Proper on the Tracer. It'll be a really important match for both teams to win. But first, let's hear Eli's thoughts on the Houston Outlaws versus Dallas Fuel match.
This one did not go the way we thought it would. I personally had Outlaws winning 3-2 and PredGod had Fuel winning 3-1. I had Outlaws winning because I thought Tracer was going to be meta, but then Genji turned out to be meta and I changed to Fuel winning. but either way no one expected this game to be as one-sided as it ended up being, especially in favor of the Outlaws. Pelican and Merit made for a nice 1-2 punch combo on the Soldier Echo comp. Dante on Doom was surprisingly strong, Lestro seemed to be playing the Lucio and Mercy super well considering he's a flex support, and Iris hit some incredible sleep darts throughout the game. Fuel really weren't prepared for this one.
Next up is the London Spitfire at 5th place. Yep, you heard that correctly. They are tied for 5th alongside the Dallas Fuel after being swept by the Shock and sweeping the Titans. I gotta say, despite the sweep, I'm not high on this team. Starting off with the good, Sparker has shown himself as a menace on the Soldier, if not anything top tier. Hottie has surprised me, looking clean on the Rhine despite having a 0% shadow success rate. Admiral I think has looked good. He diffed Masa in their game, but Mesa was playing really poorly. Landon has had a decent on it despite being known as a bad one trick, pretty much impressing me. None of these players are especially top tier though, so I don't think I can rate them too highly despite being 5th. As for the bad, Backbone has done literally nothing on the Genji. He's been really bad at him, even in the London game. His Mei is only slightly better. Poco also didn't impress me much, but he's only played one map against the Shock. But again, they seemed coordinated, but not overall a strong team, and their win primarily came from how horrifically bad Vancouver played. But before we move on, let's hear Eli Meyer's thoughts on London's game against the San Francisco Shock.
This one was a bit more one-sided than I expected, but still I didn't expect this one to be close. Spitfire's Rhine Soldier comp worked a few times but just isn't the meta strat, and they really shat the bed on map 2, which they could have easily won. And I was especially sad to see Shax not play during this one. Even though Tracer isn't super meta, he is by far the best player on the team and probably has a good soldier considering his Tracer.
Next in the standings, tied at 5th with London and Dallas with a 3-1 loss to Atlanta and a 4-1 win over Paris, the Florida Mayhem. Honestly, these guys seem really solid. Their game against Atlanta especially was surprisingly close, and I genuinely thought during Eichenwald that Mayhem were about to 3-0 the Reign. But they've lived up to the hype, I think. Someone is fantastic, the tank player, you smartasses, popping off on the Winston and Ryan and pulling out the Doomfist a bit and being impressive on it too, in my opinion. Hydron has proven himself to be suitably cracked, being dominant on the Soldier and Tracer. Majid has also proven himself to be a top tier Ana, popping off against Paris especially. Animo and Checkmate have also impressed me, though I don't consider either of them to be especially amazing. Overall, I think these guys look scary, but honestly, I think they're in their own tier right now. They are above the teams currently below them, but are not as good as the teams over them. Kind of gatekeepers at the moment, but they can only really go up with XD coming to NA as we speak. These guys are exciting. Finally, tied for 5th after sweeping the Justice and getting swept by the Outlaws, the Dallas Fuel. Oh, Fuel. Getting swept against Houston really had my power rankings scared, but your next game showed why you deserve to be on top still. Overall, the Fuel still look great to me despite the weirdness against Houston. Sparkle is still cracked out on the Genji. Edison has performed very well in the Rook Soldier and Reaper. There is still great on the Ana despite being bullied against the Outlaws. Chio has been good so far, and Hanbin has been as good as ever. There are a few problems though. One is that neither Hanbin or Fearless has impressed me all that much on the Doom, which did hurt in the mirror against Houston. Also, the Peel has been a bit underwhelming to say the most part. I think this is a lot due to Dallas's aggression. He was a lot better against Justice, but Fielder was absolutely dominated against Houston, and I feel like Chio didn't do enough to help. Granted, he was also being dominated. But overall, I think these guys are still a top team in NA, but their matching against the Glads will be a banger and will greatly help in their placements. Next up, tied for 8th place with a 3-1 loss to Justice and a 3-2 victory over the Outlaws, we have the Toronto Defiant. Honestly, these guys impressed me quite a bit, though they had their fair share of issues. Starting with the good, Chorong and Twilight still seem like a top tier support duo. Twilight is predictably really good in Ana meta, and Chorong is looking top tier despite his shaky start against Justice. Muse was fantastic on the Winston against the Outlaws, fragging out a lot and coordinating very well with Finale's Tracer. Finale has really impressed me on the Tracer, though his Genji is a bit lacking in my opinion. As for some negatives, Hisu is very good at Soldier mechanically, I feel, but I think he's too passive, preferring to sit in the back and try to get picks. He's not as proactive as a lot of the top soldiers in my opinion, like Kai, Happy, Proper, and Merit, but he's solid. He just needs to be more aggro. Hotba hasn't impressed me all too much, but he's only played one map, which is more or less carried by Happy anyway, so I don't want to judge him too hard. Overall though, I really like what I'm seeing with the Defiant, and I think they are arguably top 5 right now, in that upper mid tier with Houston, Dallas, and maybe the Justice. Before I move on, let's hear Eli Meyer's thoughts on the Toronto Defiant versus the Houston Outlaws.
And for the final match of the weekend, it was a banger. A little disappointed that the Outlaws couldn't take it, but both teams fought hard and Muse looked especially good on the Winston, and Finale Tracer also wasn't too shabby.
Next up is the Washington Justice, tied for 8th for beating the Defiant 3-1 and getting swept by the Fuel. This is another team I have mixed feelings about, but I think they look pretty good. Starting with the good, Happy and Mag are still sick with it. Happy at that one game would not get the fuck off Widow, but overall, I think he's really solid on Soldier and Widow. And Mag is still nutty on Winston, matching Fearless. DK is solid. I don't think he's top tier, but he coordinates pretty well with Mag. Krill and Opener have also proven to be a really solid backline, and not the liability they seem to be, but they do have issues. I don't think Opener is anything special, and Krillin has some bad, with a capital B, aggression issues, but was also very effective with his nades and sleeps. Overall, though, I think people are overly low in this team. They had a good game against Toronto, was solid against Dallas in the mirror, and overall, the support line surpassed expectations. Things are looking up for them. But before we move on, let's hear Eli Meyer's thoughts on the Toronto Defiant versus the Washington Justice.
I know I predicted this match correctly, but after seeing what the meta was I changed my prediction to Toronto winning 3-2. But the Defiant really shat the bed on maps 2 and 4, both of which they could have won, and obviously I have to talk about Happy's Widow, which absolutely popped off on map 3, and Decay's Genji was surprisingly not too terrible.
Finally, the Boston Uprising. I'm not too impressed by them. While they, on paper, had a decent weekend, the fact that London demolished the Titans 2 days after Boston barely scraped a win against them, though I do think the Titans played worse than the Spitfire against the Uprising. But looking at the positives, Punk is still a very strong off-tank player in my eyes. Striker isn't a top DPS anymore, or the carry I wanted, but he's still very solid at the Soldier and Reaper. Crimso, MCD, and Faith all really impressed me. Marvel only played one map, but he popped off on the Doomfist. But as for the negatives, Itzal and Victoria did not impress me very much. They were dominated by Ons and Reiner in their match. They got less than no value. Valentine has been a major disappointment for me. I want him to really shine in this Genji meta, as I rate his Genji highly from last year, but frankly he did not impress that much. Overall, this team shows promise, but I don't think they are too good at the moment. But before we move on, let's hear the Eli Meyer's thoughts on the Boston Uprising's game versus the Vancouver Titans.
Titans versus Uprising has become a pretty big rivalry ever since the Titans 2020 blow-up, and this game did not disappoint. Arguably the best game of the weekend, with both teams trading blows back and forth. This one was super duper close, but in the end Uprising took it. Both teams were kind of just playing around with their rosters, considering how many subs were made and how every player from both teams got a chance to play at least once except for Itzel. And one more small thing I noticed is how Striker didn't really carry that much in his first game back in the league. Would have liked to have seen him pop off a bit more.
Next up, the Vancouver Titans, at 11th place after a tough 3-2 loss to the Boston Uprising, and getting swept by the London Spitfire. These guys suck. Plain and simple. They make very elementary mistakes. Their game against London was tragically bad. Even Meza, their supposed best player, was 1v5ing the enemy the whole time. They consistently bench Shockwave despite him popping the hell off every time he's in the lobby. False feeds his brains out pretty frequently, and they're just a total mess. They underperformed a lot against the Spitfire in my opinion, but I don't think the Spitfire played especially well that game either. The Titans just threw that so hard, it was such an embarrassment. They're easily the worst team in the league until further notice. But before we move on, let's hear Eli Meyer's thoughts on the London Spitfires game versus the Vancouver Titans.
Honestly, the most disappointing game of week 1. I was really expecting more out of this Red Bowl rematch, and to see the Titans not run Shockwave for the first 2 maps was also extremely questionable. Spitfire just played much better, and Heidi actually looked surprisingly good on the Monkey and Rhine.
Next, tied for 12th place, is the Paris Eternal. After a sweep by the Shock and a 3-1 loss from the Mayhem. Mixed bag here again. I am not too impressed with this team. Starting with the positives, Glister was still very good. He popped off on Widow and Soldier and was probably the main reason the Eternal was competitive against Florida. Dawn and Basola have also proven to be very solid and flexible. Dawn especially has impressed me on the Doom, Winston, and Rhine, when I thought he'd be a weakness for the team. Khan had a really shaky start against the Shock, but he's since figured out his positioning and is one of the better players on the team. But Naga is just not that good on the Genji. He was really outclassed by Sam, Proper, and Checkmate, and I don't even really consider Checkmate all that good. He was solid on the Mei though. Dridro is forced to play Lucio, and while he's solid, by Dridro's own admission, Lucio is his worst hero, which does bring the team down a bit. I don't think Paros are horrible. They could compete with teams a tier above them, as we will get to see, but I have not been that impressed with their performance thus far. New York, I think they can cut a bit of slack. They had to go against Atlanta and Glads, who were looking like top teams, and they did manage to steal a map from the Glads, but they didn't look that good. Yaki was definitely a bright spot. He pretty much put the team on his back more than one time in each match. His Echo pretty much solo carried them in map 3 against the Glads. Flora looked really good against the Gliders as well, I thought, especially on the Tracer. Kellon individually is good, but that support line, Gangnam Jin, is just not good. He almost did not peel from Yunbong whatsoever. And I thought Yunbong would look good, but Nero and Hawk were so far up his ass all game, they could tell what he had for breakfast. And Gangnam Jin was just nowhere to be found. They just did not impress me too much overall. But overall, I think the ordering of these teams is very much up in the air. Shock and Atlanta easy clap their games. Everyone in the circle of suck is around the same level. Who knows where Florida goes? But my tier list wound up looking like this for next week.
And here is Eli Meyer's tier list for comparison.
As for some of the more questionable placement, Fuel I don't think looked especially good in the Winston comp, which I think should be their bread and butter. And despite me thinking there were more factors that led to the stomp, they were completely ruined by Houston. Washington I think are better than Florida still on paper, and I don't think they underperformed or anything really. They stuck it to Dallas fairly well, and they beat Toronto. And despite the loss to the Justice, I'm a Toronto believer and a bit of a Glads denier, but the two are interchangeable in my opinion. Florida are gatekeepers. London I do have faith in to compete with Boston and New York. I think they look pretty solid, even against the Shock, considering the team they were facing. Paris I think is better than the Titans, but again, they did not impress me whatsoever. Thanks for watching. Remember to hit like and subscribe for more. I upload nearly daily Overwatch League content, and I'm trying to hit 1,000 subs by the end of Season 5, so any subscription helps greatly. Thanks.